She came to London with nothing but a plan. No expectations, no promises, but somehow she became the reason a broken house felt like home again. Because sometimes all it takes is someone who stays. Everyone in London knew the name Alexander Reid. At 26, he was already the kind of man that cities built myths around, the kind whose name appeared on the front pages of financial magazines, spoken alongside words like visionary and ruthless and extraordinary. He had built his company from a single inherited asset into one of the most formidable private enterprises in Britain, and he had done it not through luck or inheritance alone, but through the particular ferocity of someone who had decided that work was the only thing left worth doing. The media called him brilliant. His rivals called him cold. Both were correct, but neither the admirers nor the enemies fully understood what lay beneath the precision and the power. Alex was not cold by nature. He had simply made himself that way, deliberately and carefully, over the course of 5 years, because the alternative was to feel everything he had lost, and that was a grief so total, so bottomless, that he had decided, somewhere in the first terrible weeks after Olivia died, that he would never risk feeling it again. So he built walls, and then he built an empire inside them. Her name was Olivia Reid, born Olivia Marsh, and she had been the kind of person who made rooms feel warmer simply by being in them. She was quick-witted and generous and unafraid of difficult conversations, of messy emotions, of the kind of deep, inconvenient love that asks things of you. She had loved Alex with the particular certainty of someone who had chosen him deliberately and completely, who knew his edges and his silences and stayed anyway. They had met when Alex was 20 and still rough at the corners, still learning which parts of himself to soften and which to trust. Olivia had not tried to change him. She had simply loved him, and in doing so had shown him what it felt like to be known. They married young. They were happy, genuinely, quietly, solidly happy, the way that people are when they have built something real together. They talked about a life that would be full and loud and expansive. Olivia wanted 3 children and Sunday mornings that stretched into the afternoon. Alex, who had grown up in a house of silence and formality, had wanted it too, more than he had ever admitted to anyone. And then, on a night in early February, 4 days before Grace was due, everything ended. The doctor said there had been no warning, a complication, rare and devastating. Olivia died in the early hours of the morning, and Grace entered the world in the same hour that her mother left it, small and perfect and entirely unaware of what her arrival had cost. Alex sat in the hospital corridor for a very long time after. He did not cry, not then. The grief was too large for tears. It sat inside him like a stone, immovable and permanent, and he simply breathed around it and told himself that he would manage, that he would survive this, that he would find a way. What he could not have known in that corridor was that surviving and living are not the same thing, that the decision he made in those first weeks to close himself off, to armor himself with work and control, to never again allow anything close enough to destroy him, would not protect him the way he intended. It would simply make him into something hollowed out, a man who functioned perfectly and felt almost nothing. And in the years that followed, it was not only Alex who paid the price for that decision. Grace Reid was 5 years old, and she was a quiet child. Not unhappy, or perhaps too young to have the language for what she was. She was gentle and watchful and extraordinarily perceptive in the way that children are when they have spent their early years learning to read rooms instead of people, to notice absence more than presence. She had large, dark eyes that seemed to take everything in and give very little back, and a small, serious face that broke into smiles rarely, but completely, so that when she did smile, it was always a little surprising. She lived in a house that had everything a child could need and lacked almost entirely the particular warmth that children survive on. The mansion in Kensington was grand and perfectly maintained. Mrs. Hargreaves, the housekeeper, made sure of that. And Grace's routine was structured and consistent. Meals at set times, educational programs, carefully chosen books, a bedtime that never varied. She was well-fed and well-dressed and thoroughly cared for in every material sense. But her father was a ghost. He arrived late after she was in bed. He left before she was awake. On the rare evenings their paths crossed, he was careful with her. Not in kind, never in kind, but careful the way a man is careful with something fragile, something he is afraid of dropping. He looked at her sometimes with an expression she could not read, something that moved across his face quickly and was gone before she could name it. She had learned not to reach for him too eagerly. She had learned that silence was safer than wanting. Every evening, between 7 and 8, she would sit by her bedroom window and watch the gate at the end of the drive. Sometimes his car appeared. More often it did not. But she waited every time, with the particular hopefulness of a child who have not yet been able to stop believing that today might be different. She did not tell anyone about the waiting. She was 5 years old and she already understood, at some wordless level, that some kinds of wanting were better kept quiet. Mary Osei had come to London with 2 suitcases, a nursing qualification she hadn't yet been able to place, and the particular kind of optimism that belongs to people who have faced genuinely hard things and chosen, against all reasonable evidence, to remain soft. She had grown up the eldest of 4 in a household where difficulty was a permanent guest. When her mother became ill, it was Mary who took over. 3 years of managing school runs and bedtimes and the particular logistics of a family that needed more than it had. She had done it without bitterness and without performance because it needed to be done, and she was the one who could do it. That was simply how she was built. She was 23 now and practical in the way that early responsibility makes people practical, and gentle in the way that people are gentle when they have learned that gentleness is not weakness but a form of strength that most people mistake. She did not arrive at things with noise or drama. She arrived quietly, took stock of what was needed, and began. She had not planned to become a nanny, but she was good with children. Good in the specific, unhurried way that was less about technique and more about attention. The listing for the Reid household had been specific, discreet, professional, patient, long-term. She had applied without knowing anything about the family, knowing only that those words described exactly what she was. She did not know, arriving at the tall wrought iron gate in Kensington on a cold Tuesday morning, that she was about to walk into a house full of grief. She was not prepared for the weight of Alex's presence, the particular silence of the mansion, or the look in a 5-year-old girl's eyes that said she had been waiting for someone to stay for a very long time. She was never meant to change anything. She came looking for a job. She did not come looking for a family. But that, as it turned out, was precisely what she found. She was hired after a single interview, cold, brief, relentlessly professional. Alex had read her CV with the careful attention he brought to contracts, asked several questions that were more like assessments than inquiries, and dismissed her without warmth but without discourtesy. By 5 o'clock that evening, his assistant had called to confirm the position. Mary moved into the staff quarters the following Monday. Her room was small and serviceable, and she made it warmer within the first hour. A cloth on the table, 2 photographs on the windowsill, a small plant she had brought in a paper bag from the market. Small things, but a room with small personal things in it is a room that has been inhabited, and inhabiting a space was something Mary did with intention. The house itself took longer to understand. Mrs. Hargreaves, who had been with the Reid family for 11 years and possessed the particular loyalty of someone who had seen everything and chosen to remain anyway, showed Mary the routines with quiet efficiency. Meals at specific times, limited television, Grace's schedule printed on 2 sides of an A4 sheet, detailed down to the afternoon reading block. There was a system, and the system worked.
and Mary was expected to maintain it. What the system could not tell her was why the house felt the way it did. There was no raised voice, no obvious sadness, no visible wound. And yet the place had the particular atmosphere of somewhere that had been holding its breath for a long time, as though something had gone wrong once, years ago, and the air had never quite cleared. She met Grace on the second day. The child was in the garden, sitting on a stone bench with a stuffed rabbit pressed against her chest, watching a bird on the lawn. She looked up when Mary appeared, assessed her with those large, careful eyes, and said nothing. Mary sat down on the far end of the bench and opened a book she had brought from her room. She did not speak to Grace. She did not try to engage her or charm her or make her comfortable. She simply sat and read and let Grace decide what she wanted to do with that. 5 minutes passed, and then Grace's voice came, small and deliberate. She wanted to know what Mary was reading. Mary told her. Grace wanted to know if they could read it together. Mary said yes. It was a small thing, but for a child who had learned that reaching out usually meant reaching into empty space, it was everything. For the first few weeks, Alex and Mary existed in the same house the way two weather systems exist in the same sky, proximate but separate, moving by their own logic, rarely intersecting. He left before Grace was awake. He returned after she was asleep. On the handful of evenings when he appeared while the household was still in motion, he moved through it quickly and quietly, nodding at Mary with the courteous detachment of a man who has remembered to be polite but has not quite arrived in the room. He asked brief practical questions about Grace's day. He accepted the answers. He disappeared into his study. Mary watched this without comment. She was not there to fix him. She was not there to draw conclusions. She was there for Grace, and Grace needed her attention entirely. And Grace was beginning to open. It happened slowly, the way all genuine things happen, not in sudden declarations, but in small daily accretions. Grace began to speak more at mealtimes, first in short sentences, then in longer ones, then in the meandering, exploratory way of children who had found someone safe to talk to. She began to initiate things, asking for particular books, suggesting games, bringing Mary objects from her room to show her, as though she had only just remembered that sharing was possible. She laughed more. The laughter was tentative at first, brief, as though she was checking whether it was allowed, and then fuller and more frequent until it became simply part of how Grace moved through her days. The house changed around it. Not dramatically, the silence didn't shatter, the order didn't break, but there was something different in the air, something slightly less held. Mary noticed it, Mrs. Hargreaves noticed it, and somewhere in the late hours when he walked alone in his study and the sounds of the house settled around him, Alex noticed it too. He said nothing, but he listened. There was a room on the 3rd floor that no one entered. Mrs. Hargreaves had made this clear without elaboration on Mary's first day. A brief mention, matter of fact, the way one mentions a locked gate or a broken step. That room was private. Mary had accepted this without question, had passed the door many times on her way to the linen cupboard at the end of the hall, and had thought nothing more of it. It was Grace who told her what was inside. One afternoon, Grace had taken Mary's hand and led her upstairs, not to the 3rd floor. She stopped one landing short and pointed up at the door above them. She said that was where her mother was, that her father kept Olivia's things there, her pictures, her clothes, the smell of her perfume on his scarf. She said Mrs. Hargreaves had told her once, quietly, that her father went there sometimes when he thought no one was watching. Mary stood at the foot of that last flight of stairs and felt the full weight of the house settle on her in a way it hadn't before. Not the grief of it. She had understood from the beginning that grief lived here, but the specific shape of it. A man who had sealed his loss into a room and returned to it in secret, unable to put it down and unable to carry it forward. A child who knew her mother only as a presence kept behind a closed door. A family frozen at the moment of its worst loss, unable to move. She did not go up. It was not her room to enter.
But from that day, she understood Alex differently, not as a man who had chosen distance over love, but as a man who had so much love and so much pain knotted together inside him that he could not separate one from the other. He had not stopped loving. He had simply run out of ways to carry it. It happened without announcement, as the important things do. Alex had come home early one evening, a meeting cancelled, a rare gap in the architecture of obligation that usually consumed him, and had stood in the doorway of the sitting room for a long moment before anyone noticed him. Inside, Grace and Mary had built a fort from sofa cushions and blankets. Mary was reading aloud inside it, a torchlight in one hand, doing voices for each character with the particular commitment of someone who understands that children deserve a full performance. Grace was pressed against her side, her rabbit in her lap, her face alive with attention. And then something in the story made her laugh, not the polite, tentative laugh she had been practicing, but a real one, unguarded and bright, the laugh of a child who has completely forgotten to be careful. Alex stood in the doorway and heard his daughter laugh, and something in him, something that had been very still for a very long time, moved. He did not go in, he was not ready for that, but he stood there far longer than he had intended, and when he finally turned away, it was not with the brisk efficiency that usually propelled him through the house. He moved slowly. He left his study door open, and in the quiet hours that followed, something in the way he sat at his desk was slightly different, less armored, less certain that the armor was the point. Mary found him in the kitchen later that night when she came down after Grace was settled. He was standing at the counter with a glass of water, and he looked, for the first time since she had arrived, like a man who was tired of something deeper than work. She made tea without asking. She set a cup beside him and said nothing. After a moment, without looking at her, he spoke. He said that Grace had not laughed like that in a long time, not that he had heard. He wasn't sure he had heard it before. Mary said nothing, because nothing needed saying. He already knew what the silence was. After that night, things shifted, slowly, without announcement, but unmistakably. Alex began to come home earlier, not every evening. Old habits are stubborn, and the work was real. And there were nights when the only honest thing was that he was still not ready, but more evenings than before. He appeared at breakfast sometimes, which had never happened. He learned that Grace liked honey on her toast and not jam, that she was afraid of thunderstorms but would not admit it, that she had a way of singing to herself very quietly when she was drawing, just above the threshold of hearing. These were small things, but to a man who had been absent in every way that mattered, they were enormous. They were the first steps back into a life he had been standing outside of for 5 years, pressing his face to the glass and telling himself it was better this way. Grace noticed. She noticed everything, and she began, carefully, in her measured way, to let him in a little more each time he appeared. She showed him her drawings. She told him about the books she and Mary were reading. One evening, during a thunderstorm, she appeared at the door of his study without explanation and simply sat in the armchair in the corner with her rabbit, and he let her, and they remained like that together for an hour while the rain came down, not speaking, but present. It was the closest they had been in years. Mary watched all of this from a careful distance. She did not engineer these moments or prompt them or comment on them. She simply made the space for them and then stepped back, because she understood that what was happening between Alex and his daughter was fragile and new, like a thing that has been underground for a long time and is only just finding its way to light. It needed room, not attention. But she was aware of him. More and more she was aware of him, not as an employer or a complication, but as a person, as someone who was trying, quietly and imperfectly, to become something better than what grief had made him. Loving this content? Like, share and subscribe to this channel. You don't want to miss what's coming next. He had started to watch her too, though he would not have named it that. He noticed the way she moved through the house, without urgency, but without waste, purposeful in the specific way of people who have always had more to do than time allows and have learned to prioritize. He noticed the way she spoke to Grace, not talking down or performing patience, but genuinely interested, genuinely present, asking questions she actually wanted the answers to. He noticed the way she sat in the evenings in the garden when Grace was asleep, reading or simply still, unbothered by the quiet. She was not performing softness. She simply was it. And in a life that had been populated entirely by people who are performing something, confidence, deference, indifference, ambition. But one evening, sitting across from her in the garden in the late light with his cup of tea and the sound of the city softened by distance, he ran out of convincing arguments. She said something quiet and true, something about grace, about patience, about the particular courage it takes for a person to keep reaching for someone who hasn't yet learned to reach back. And he looked at her and felt, for the first time in 5 years, genuinely and undeniably seen. It was not comfortable. He was not used to being seen. He had organized his entire life around not being seen. But sitting across from Miriose in the fading light of that September evening, the old instinctive defenses felt, for the first time, exhausting. He opened the door on a Sunday. He had not planned it. He had simply found himself on the 3rd floor landing, key in hand, and had made the decision before he had fully thought it through, which was perhaps the only way it could have happened, because if he had thought it through, he would have turned back. The room was exactly as he had left it. Olivia's cardigan over the chair, her book on the nightstand, the bookmark still in place at page 211, as though she had simply stepped out and would return. The faint trace of her perfume, barely there now, like a word whispered in a room that has since grown silent. He stood in the middle of it for a long time. He thought about the night she died. He thought about the days immediately after when the grief was so acute that he had been unable to eat, unable to sleep, unable to do anything except sit with Grace in the hospital and look at this small, bewildering creature who had his nose and Olivia's hands and no idea, none at all, of what had just happened. He thought about the decision he had made, not consciously, not in a single moment, but incrementally, day by day, to put everything he could not bear into rooms with closed doors and to build his life in the spaces that remained. He thought about what that decision had cost. He sat in the chair beside the window, Olivia's chair, where she used to read in the mornings, and he grieved her properly for the first time, not with the controlled, managed grief of a man who has rationed himself, but the real grief, the one he had been running from, the one that had always been there waiting. He wept without performance or dignity, and it was terrible and necessary. And when it was over, something in him felt different. Not lighter, exactly, but more honest. He picked up the photograph from the bedside table, himself and Olivia, young and laughing, the summer before everything changed. And he spoke to her the way a man speaks when he is alone, and the door is closed, and there is no one left to be strong for. He told her about Grace, about how she laughed now, about the rabbit and the books, and the way she had appeared in his study during the storm without being asked. He told her that he was sorry it had taken him so long. He told her that somewhere along the line, he had confused keeping everything still with keeping her close, and that he understood now they were not the same thing. And then, carefully, he told her about Miriose. He didn't know what it was. He couldn't say it simply, but he told her that someone had come into the house and without trying, without demanding anything, had made it feel like a place where people lived instead of simply endured. He told her this felt like something he needed her to know. He didn't ask for permission, that was not something he could ask, but he needed to say it out loud in this room before he could say anything else anywhere else. He set the photograph down, he stood, he left the room, not closing it with the finality of before, but gently, the way you close a door you intend to open again.
Then he went downstairs where his daughter was in the kitchen making biscuits with Mary, and he sat down at the table with them, and he did not leave.
It happened on a Sunday, which was perhaps appropriate, because Sundays were what Olivia had always wanted, long and unhurried and full. Grace was at her first birthday party, a milestone Mary had gently engineered, and Alex was home alone in the garden doing something he had not done in years. Sitting with no purpose, no document in hand, no call to make. Just sitting. Looking at the garden that Olivia had chosen and that he had maintained without ever really seeing. Mary came out with 2 cups of tea and sat down across from him, and for a long while neither of them spoke. The silence between them had changed over the months. It was no longer the silence of 2 people in the same house who did not know each other. It was the silence of 2 people who had said a great many things without words and were now reckoning with what had accumulated. He spoke first. He told her, without preamble, that he had spent 5 years building a life that was designed to be safe, and that it had worked in the way that very wrong things sometimes work for a long time before they don't. He told her that he was afraid, that loving someone, really loving them, the way he had loved Olivia, the way he was beginning to feel himself move towards something that frightened him in its clarity, meant accepting the possibility of losing them. And he knew what that loss felt like. He had been living inside it for 5 years. He told her that she had not pushed him toward any of this, that she had not tried to fix him or reach him or change him, that she had simply stayed, consistently and without agenda, and that in doing so, she had somehow undone what 5 years of deliberate distance had built. He could not explain the mechanics of it. He only knew that it was true. Mary listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, she sat for a moment in the quiet. Then she said that she knew what it had cost him to say it, that she was not going to pretend she hadn't seen it happening or that she hadn't felt it herself. But she was also not going to make him promises she couldn't guarantee or tell him that love was not risky, because it was. She said that the risk was the point, that a love with no risk in it was not love but comfort, and comfort was not what either of them needed. She said she was not going anywhere. He looked at her in the afternoon light. This woman who had walked into his grief-soaked house with a cloth for her table and a plant in a paper bag, who had sat in silence with his daughter until she was safe enough to speak, who had, without any intention of doing so, made him want to be something more than what pain had reduced him to, and he reached across the table and took her hand. He did not say anything more. There was nothing more that needed saying. Grace Reid, who once sat alone by her window each evening waiting for a car that rarely came, was no longer the child who had learned to make herself small. She was still gentle, still watchful. Those things were part of her, baked in early, hers forever. But she was no longer afraid of wanting. She took her father's hand unprompted. She told her father long and meandering stories about things that had happened at nursery and expected to be listened to all the way to the end. She laughed with her whole face. Alex came home before dark most evenings. He had not stopped working. The brilliance and the drive were not things that grief had given him. They were his, genuinely his, and they remained. But the work no longer consumed everything. There were things he returned for, and returning for them was not weakness, but the bravest thing he did each day. He had opened the room on the 3rd floor once more, not long after the Sunday in the garden. He had gone in with Grace this time, carefully, at her pace, answering questions about the photographs and the cardigan and the bookmarks still held in the book at page 211. He had told Grace about her mother with the openness that he had never before been able to summon. Who Olivia was, what she had loved, how she had laughed, what she had wanted for the 3 of them. Grace had listened with her full attention, and at the end she had asked if they could put one of the photographs downstairs where she could see it. Alex had said yes. The room was no longer sealed. It was simply a room, part of the house, part of the story, present without being a prison. And Mary who had come looking for nothing more than a job and a foothold in a city that rarely gave second chances, had found herself woven into something she had not gone looking for.
She had not set out to love this family. She had simply been consistently, stubbornly, quietly herself, and the family had built itself around her presence the way a garden grows toward a reliable source of light. She was still soft. She had always been soft, and she had never apologized for it, and she did not now. She had simply learned in the months she spent in that house that softness in the right hands is not fragility. It is the most durable thing there is. On a Sunday evening in late October, with the garden going amber and the smell of dinner coming from the kitchen and Grace's voice carrying from somewhere upstairs, Alex stood at the back door and looked out at the life he was living and felt, without surprise, almost with recognition, that it was the one he had always been meant to have. Not the one grief had interrupted, not the one he had built in its absence, the one that was being assembled, slowly and imperfectly, from what remained. It was not the life Olivia had imagined on all those Sunday mornings, but it was a life, full and present and continuing, which was in the end exactly what she would have wanted for him. Is love worth the risk again? For Alexander Reid, the answer was yes. It had always been yes. He had simply needed someone to stay long enough for him to remember.
Loving this content? Like, share and subscribe to this channel. You don't want to miss what's coming next.